Namaste everyone from tummy.com, a yoga platform for yoga teachers and yoga teachers in training. In our previous video, we covered the warm-up section of the first part to yoga sequencing for the peak pose Vajrasana or Thunderbolt pose. In today's video, we will cover the second part of the sequence that includes the practice of Vajrasana and also the cooling and counter poses to end the sequence. After the practice of the 12 warm-ups that we did, which involved the lower part of the body, right from your toes to your hips, we now come to the practice of the peak pose. So we will begin in tabletop pose. Tabletop pose is post the practice of these warm-up poses just to relax the ankles and the feet. From here, we move into a slight variation, still putting stress on your ankles and your toes, kind of stretching the entire lower body. From here, we move into the variation of child pose, where you're still balancing on the toes because you still need to tell your students to connect to the sensation they have right there at the toes because they may not be still ready. From here, we move into the toe squat, which is from child pose. You inhale to come up to keep your back straight. We have worked on hip stability in our warm-up. So by now, the students should be a little comfortable with their hips and therefore testing whether their ankles can take the weight of the hips. So you balance yourself here. You can request them to be here for a little longer, or you could flow down into a slight variation to just, even adjust, probably, get into alignment with your ankles and with your feet. So this could be a variation of this toe squat pose, or it could be a pose to help you get into alignment with your ankles and feet. From here, we come into a little variation here. We know that Vajrasana, the practice of Vajrasana is mainly for digestion. And in this Kriya, we hold the breath. We teach the students to hold their breath. And when you hold the breath, it kind of keeps your body light. So this is, while it is not essential to practice this, but you can just give a kind of a variation, a creativity in the peak pose sequence. Exhaling to gently move into a child pose variation on your toes still. The reason is we don't want students to directly sit on their heels with the weight of the hips being placed because it can cause injury sometimes when done in a jerk. So this is a simpler way to get into Vajrasana. So from the child pose, while you're still balancing on your toes, you slowly request him to slide down and sit back, extending to be completely comfortable with the pressure at the knees and the ankles. And you inhale to come into Thunderbolt pose or Vajrasana. So from our warm-up, we now got into the second part of the sequence, which is the practice itself of the peak pose. We're moving further into a variation of Thunderbolt pose. The first one is where you're actually relaxing the ankles. So of course, when you're here, the students can stay longer if they're comfortable. They can start off with 4 to 6 breaths or even go beyond. It depends on each body and their comfort. From here, we move to this next variation, a gentle dropping of the head and the neck back. This actually eases out the pressure on your ankles and your knees because the hips are moving outwards, so the lesser weight of the hips on your ankles. So it's actually a very relaxing pose from the stress and strain here to a relaxing pose here. The next one is we come back into tabletop pose to completely relax, acting as a counter pose and as well as a cooling pose. A counter pose to ease the ankles, a cooling pose to relax the entire lower body here without putting too much weight on the ankles and knees. We go forward into the next as part of the cooling down, as also including all the variations of Vajrasana. We come back into the second round of practice of the peak pose here. I'm sure by now the students would be very comfortable with what they were here. The second round they can hold longer and they can actually connect and feel how, I mean, they can actually feel the difference in the body here. From here we move on to a slight variation where there is a deeper pressure of the ankles. You could choose to do this if the students are ready. And this again needs to be done on both the sides because we want to make sure that both ankles are equally worked at. From here we come down to the next set of poses, which is more of a dynamic flow to get into a variation of Vajrasana where you are overlapping the feet. So you start from tabletop, child pose, you cross your feet here. While you're in child pose, you cross your feet, overlapping the left over the right, and then you inhale, you sit up. You come into the seated windshield wiper pose, which is acting more like a relaxing and counter pose. You repeat it again to do it with the other way, with your right over the left. Over here, it isn't actually the right over the left. And then you end it again with a cooling pose, with a flow, complete relaxing, and the final step and the final round of the peak pose practice, Vajrasana. From here, you move into a deeper variation here where there is probably the students may be ready. You can take a chance here. A gentle lift of the knees off the floor. It's called the ankle stretch pose, where, of course, you need to be very clear that you're not going to suddenly jump back. You know, it has to be done very, very slowly. Maybe you can lift one knee first and then they can work with the other knee. So you can actually request them to go step by step. You come back into a relaxing pose here. And our final relaxing here, which is also like a counter pose, is the downward facing dog. So from all those seated poses and kneeling poses and cooling poses, we come into a counter pose where you're stretching all the muscles of the legs and the hips. So from all the contractions that was happening here, there was no stretch, remember, in any of the muscles of the leg. It was just engaging or rather putting pressure on your joints. So we are only coming here to stretch and feel comfortable. So from the downward facing dog pose, we chose to relax the body back again in round angle pose, which was done earlier, bringing stability on the hips. And you could choose to add Shavasana at the end of the practice to end the entire sequence of peak pose Vajrasana based on what your students want. So thus ends the practice of the peak pose yoga sequence for Vajrasana, which is Thunderbolt Pose. Let us have a quick recap of the entire sequence to help us get or help us reconnect and recollect what was covered. So we spoke about warming up, choosing 12 poses, which involved from the toes to the hips. We spoke about the actual practice of the peak pose, which involved about probably, 7 ways to go down into Vajrasana. So you could choose to avoid whatever is not suitable for your students. We continued with different variations with the overlapping of your feet soles with a bit of a stretch in a twist and a deeper stretch with pressure on your ankles. And we ended it with a bound angle pose with cooling hip stability pose. This is just one of the ways a peak pose sequence can be created. Of course, this idea can be applicable to another sequence which involves a different, a different peak pose. It could be even your downward facing dog here, or it could be your toe balance. So this is just one way of creating a yoga sequence. This kind of structure can be used across many kinds of yoga sequences, and if your students are ready, this can be added to this can be part of the daily practice, also as part of their home practice, right? Stay tuned with you could actually rewind to go back to see how the entire structure is followed, and you could uh, get a feel and a sense of how it works in a very systematic way, and how your students will actually feel the transition from the warm up to the Thunderbolt pose, and a different kind of transition with variations of Thunderbolt pose and counter pose with a cooling pose. In the upcoming videos from tummy.com, we will be covering other kinds of themes. So stay tuned with us, drop in your comments, and namaste from all of us from tummy.com, a yoga platform for yoga teachers and yoga teachers in training.